Hello and welcome to India's World. After 3 decades of near double-digit growth, China has transformed itself from predominantly rural and poor society into one of the world's 3 largest trading nations. It has a transportation system which rivals that of the developed countries, and its population is increasingly middle class and urban. Rapid economic growth has resulted in nearly $4 trillion in foreign exchange, much of it invested in US Treasury securities. However, China's growth now seems to be slowing down, with significant implications for the world. It is estimated that a 2 percentage point decline in Chinese growth would lead to about a 0.3% decline in global GDP per year. Economists say that considering that China is also a key market besides being the workshop of the world, the impact of the slowdown on global GDP could be as high as 0.5% per year. To discuss the likely implications of the Chinese economic slowdown, I have with me 3 distinguished experts. We have with us Professor Nitin Desai, and an eminent economist. He served as the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. He served in the Planning Commission. He was also the Under Secretary General of the UN for Economic and Social Affairs. Thank you for coming here. And we have with us Professor Srikanth, Kondapalli, one of our foremost experts on China. He is Professor of Chinese Studies at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And Professor Alka Acharya, a well-known face on Rajya Sabha TV. She is Director of Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi and also a professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, JNU. So I welcome all of you to this discussion. Professor Desai, let me begin with you. What are the main causes of the Chinese economy slowing down?
I'd say that this is a transition which practically every East Asian has gone through. As you transit from being a low-income country with a large rural to urban influx, basically low technology manufacturing, into a middle-income status where you have to go into more complicated manufacturing, where your labor force issues also start changing. This transition is an inevitable one, and I don't think anything is terribly wrong as such in the Chinese economy. 7% growth is not that low, you know.
But you see, is it because that when you're a low-income group country, a less developed country, the potential is huge and you can use R&D developed elsewhere to grow, so you get high growth rates, and you reach a stage where income levels are high, when you can no longer live off the innovations elsewhere, you have to innovate yourselves, and it becomes that much more difficult.
It's partly because in many ways the Chinese growth was driven by the heavy public investment in infrastructure in other areas. Yeah. And that was certainly very important if you're developing a manufacturing base. Yeah. But now that you get into more sophisticated areas of manufacturing and services, this is not as much of a driver of growth as it was when you were essentially setting up large special economic zones and so things of that sort. It's a much more complex issue that they face. There are other issues like the environmental issue, the need to, in fact, they need to slow down.
Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, people blame the slump largely to the slowdown in the housing sector in China. And they say there's overcapacity in the Chinese housing market. Housing sales fell by 10% in 2014, and about 7 years worth of inventory in housing exists today. How has this come about?
Well, housing sector is the most important part of the GDP. It contributes to about 16% of the GDP growth in China. So it's huge because iron and steel, cement and talent, human talent, everything is diverted to the real estate building process. And last 2-3 years, there's been substantial decline, roughly about 1 to 2% decline every year. And this year, there's a huge slump in terms of the housing not picking up. Most of these are ghost cities that have been built up in China, where you see no occupancy rate. So I think housing sector was the one which has been the most troublesome in terms of the GDP decline of China. Also, there is since so much of the Economist, for instance, had suggested before that nearly 60% of the FDI had been actually diverted towards the real estate in China in the reform program. So that's a huge diversion of the capital from abroad. So that is, sometimes this is not economically viable if you build up all these and you're not getting returns.
Professor, is there also a little problem of banks having overcommitted on real estate and so on?
There is. And we're going to discuss that in a minute. But let me take the issue of ghost towns to Professor Alka Acharya. How was the real estate bubble allowed to grow so much? So much so that a Beijing newspaper actually did something called a ghost town index. And this ghost town index actually shows that there are at least 50 cities in which half or more than half of the housing is not occupied at all.
Yeah, I mean, as was just said, that this housing bubble really exploded some time back when the amount of investment that was going, you see, after all, the economy was being driven by infrastructure development and the investment that was going into infrastructure development. And it was responsible for creating a lot of jobs, absorbing the migrant labor, and there was a demand. But unfortunately, the slowdown starts.
The supply has clearly outstripped demand.
Exactly,
50%,
but that was part of the whole infrastructure-focused economic strategy.
Of the central government or of the provinces?
Both. At the central level, and this was in many ways mirrored at the provincial levels. Now, about 4 years ago, you start to see two things happen. Of course, the debate about slowing down the economy has started much before 2011 because concerns about the impact on the environment, the whole structure change that was necessary had started much earlier. And then you had the global financial crisis coming in, which actually accelerated the urgency to restructure the economy. And what we are now seeing is a very multifaceted structural transformation, in which you have all sorts of questions like the growing urbanization, question of employment, migration, changing demographic structure, the whole debt issue that is, beginning, and there you have a whole controversial kind of debate going on whether this debt is good or bad and how is it going to impact. And of course, the whole shift that Xi Jinping has outlined in the last two party congresses, 13th and 14th, this huge new package and the legal and technological reforms.
He's pretending that this is deliberate slowdown, this is planned slowdown, this so-called new normal he talks about. But is it planned?
I don't think he's saying it's planned. He's saying that yes, we've reached there and he's taken it up front. He's not saying it's planned, but he is saying that it is good for China. This is the new normal and that this is part of the rebalancing that was inevitable in many ways, and therefore it's something good. And he's saying that, well, at 7%, if it's the new normal is 7%, it's still better than the regional.
People are saying less than 7. 6.8 is what I've been reading in the literature.
7.4, 7.7, that is really the estimate.
7.5 is what they were aiming for last year. It's probably, they say the figures are fudged.
They were aiming for 8.
This year they're aiming for 7 and people think that it will be 6.8.
Yeah, there are differences.
You wanted to say something quickly.
Well, basically, there is also a problem about statistics. As Vice Premier Li Keqiang told US Ambassador in the WikiLeaks revelations, please don't believe in Chinese statistics. This is what his submission to the US Ambassador. But that apart, yeah. I think the structure of the Chinese economy is actually going huge transformations. 59% of the GDP is by the manufacturing sector. And all of this is for exports. China had become the largest trading partner, as you mentioned. Now, because of the domestic consumption decreasing in the US, EU, and Japan, and Korea, which are the largest trading partners for China, $560 billion with the US, $530 billion with EU, about $400 billion with Japan, about $400 with the ASEAN trade. I mean, there is a huge problem for China in terms of the manufacturing sector to be sustained. So I think they are shifting because domestic consumption is just about 30% in China. So they are now trying to expand, restructure the whole GDP, which is what the 12th five-year plan suggested. But you cannot simply enhance the domestic consumption to sustain the economic growth rates.
Yeah. But we've run out of time on this segment. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the implications of Chinese economic slowdown. Professor Desai, with the Chinese GDP growth expected to be less than 7% this year, I'm not quoting the Chinese figures, I'm quoting figures of other people who are focused on the Chinese economy, the lowest in quarter of a century. So do you think China, which used to be the motor of economic growth globally, will actually become a drag on economic growth now?
Well, it'll have an impact. If you gave a number which said that a 2% reduction in Chinese growth would mean 0.3. I've seen estimates which have put it even higher. Because a third of global growth in the past 2 decades was because of Chinese growth. 1/3. In fact, it's a complete reversal. 20 years ago, 30% was the weight of the US in global growth, 10% was China's. Now it is 33% China, 20% US, 10% Europe. So the impact would be much greater. You see this already in the commodity prices, right? You're already seeing this. Then there's the spillover effect when the commodity price fellows don't have the money to buy, which will affect us. Yeah. Because a lot of our money which came into India was commodity money from the Middle East particularly, plus the export markets that we would have would also suffer. So certainly the Chinese slowdown, particularly in the context of the stagnation in Europe and sort of hesitant recovery in the US, will have a big impact. And what will be a slowdown in the commodity producers?
No, we're going to discuss that in a minute. But before that, let me come to you, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. Now, this overcapacity is not only in the housing sector. Take the steel sector. I was looking at some figures. China's steel output is 7 times that of Japan. Japan is the world's number two steel producer. Idle capacity alone is twice the size of US steel industry. Overproduction has led to a plummeting of the prices of steel. People are saying steel is available at the price of cabbages. Now, was this a result of speculative investment alone, or there are other reasons for it?
Steel production actually is very, very crucial for China's in the last 5 decades actually. Mao Zedong used to say, we will surpass the UK steel production by 580 million tons during the Great Leap Forward period. Steel actually was the basis for the, if you look at the Industrial Revolution onwards, the iron and steel has been the basis for. But of course, there is a huge change in with the knowledge economy, there is a huge change in the whole economic structures all across the globe. It is true that there has been, for instance, automobile sector is declining. Last year's sales in China, there is a huge decrease in the demand for automobile, which has a huge component of iron and steel industry into it. Then construction industry is also getting, it's a problematic now in China. So I think the emphasis on iron and steel is the crux of the decline in the GDP growth rates in China.
But Beijing now says that they will rein in this speculative investment in steel, and they will do restructure. How will they do it? It's not easy. It's not, if once you've created the capacity, you've created the capacity.
True. There is also the problem of environmental issues. For instance, in Beijing and other cities, they have simply removed iron and steel industries. Baotou Steel, for instance, has been non-functional in Beijing, partly because of the environmental issues and Olympics and a host of other conferences being held in Beijing. So they just removed all these industries from.
So they can restructure through a fiat. Is that what you're saying?
With the state regulation.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Alka, I can understand obsession of a planned economy with steel. I mean, we were also obsessed with steel, when we were a planned economy. But how is it that overcapacity was built not only in steel but also in cement, in glass, in coal mining, in aluminium, in shipbuilding, and a host of other industries? For example, in 2012, China had a capacity to produce 2.9 billion tons of cement, but actual demand was only 2.1 billion. 3/4 of China's 200 biggest airports are losing money, but there's still plans to build 100 more. So what on earth is going on?
See, there are 2 aspects to this whole thing. One is, of course, that what we are looking at are the consequences of that stress, investment-led, infrastructure development-led kind of a growth. So that's one part, and that has created overcapacity, which is now being sought to be part of the whole restructuring. The other is that you have now a conscious decision to invest again in building airports, new airports. Some 100 new airports are slated to be built and all. I mean, this is part of, again, a process of streamlining, but at the same time continuing the momentum, so that you are not really faced with a slowdown in terms of jobs, in terms of they are trying to now shift towards consumption-led growth. So you need to really create those kind of, and also I think there is a larger picture which is emerging, which is going to now absorb this excess capacity, which is China's move into Asia in terms of infrastructure building. Look at the kind of connectivities they are spreading through Asia, the new railway lines, the roads, they're building things in Africa, Latin America, and so a lot of this is going to be shifted also. So this capacity is not going to really just lie idle.
Okay. Let's go global. Remember how the Koreans went global in terms of construction in the Middle East when after the oil crisis, because they had the same issue. They built up capacities for domestic infrastructure. Yeah. They'd done that work, and then they used those capacities to make a big splash as builders internationally. The Chinese have already started doing this through the aid program. My guess is they'll start doing this on a commercial scale now.
Professor Kondapalli, was this overinvestment also a result, as he asked you earlier, of a credit explosion in China after the 2008 economic crisis? And cities and regions started competing with each other in investing. And land and housing was crucial because that's where, through land sales, is where they get their revenue from. Now that this whole picture seems to be changing, how will it impact the finances of Chinese cities and regions?
Well, actually, two schools of thought on this. One is fiscal stimulus in the background of the Asian financial crisis of 1997, as well as the global financial crisis of 2008. So the approach is to spend huge sums, $500 billion in the 1997 financial crisis, $830 billion in the 2008 financial crisis. So they spend more than $1 trillion on infrastructure projects. So as a result, also we have huge local debt, $1.7 trillion of local debt. Provinces and townships, counties, etc. have accumulated so far. So this is one school within China which has suggested. Second is the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Economists. They argued that we should not spend much of the state, stimulus packages. Let there be, settling down of the market. Quietly, it will, kind of regroup and then. But the dominant school is of spending in terms of the infrastructure projects, and so you see the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank of $42 billion outlay. You have the new development bank of the BRICS, some $42 billion by the Chinese, and then you also have when Nawaz Sharif went to Beijing in November last year, there is the $45 billion for the Sino-Pak Economic Corridor. They have committed for. So this amounts to about $220 billion. However, as part of the continental Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, the ADB estimates that we require about $757 billion a year for the infrastructure projects. Cumulatively, by 2020, we need about $8 trillion for these infrastructure projects. Chinese do not have that much of outlays for all these. Of course, it has to be step-by-step, incremental kind of approach that we all have to take in terms of this infrastructure. But the philosophy is that the state promotes infrastructure projects rather than the market.
And that will continue?
That will continue.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing the implications of Chinese economic slowdown. Professor Desai, would you say that the past decade's building boom in China, the growth in China, has been a huge driver of global energy prices? And as a consequence, when China slows down, besides the shale oil revolution, it's also affected energy prices. Not only energy prices, but as you pointed out earlier, commodity prices.
Yes, absolutely. It is China was the biggest player in every single commodity market. Yes. Not just oil, but also there are other factors at work also. The shale oil, the strategic interests of the Saudis and the US. But in other areas, it is basically the slowdown of Chinese demand.
Okay. Alka, do you think that the commodity shakeout linked to China's slowdown spells tough times for countries like Zambia, which supplied copper, where copper mines are owned by the Chinese and where they've had to call in the IMF? Venezuela, which was a large oil supplier, and all the debt is with Chinese banks, where China may actually now come to control oil fields, we don't know. Australia, which was one of the largest coal suppliers. So could this crisis actually lead to China exercising greater control over these markets and governments, more like more in an imperialist manner than ever before?
Well, the last bit I think is a far more, it requires a detailed discussion as to the nature of the Chinese control. But you know what I think,
your laugh suggests it's a stupid question, is it?
Not that. I think we have to see how the Chinese are really trying to tackle both the problems. One is definitely that in the short run, you are definitely going to see an impact on the commodity prices and the whole position in terms of energy commodity. That's definitely going to start to adjust to the factor that here is the factory of the world which is slowing down. On the other hand, you also have the Chinese now looking at two very significant shifts in the global economy. One is the diversification of the production process itself. You no longer have, like today, as people say, that made in China is made all over the world, in the sense that you have products coming from, the commodities coming, natural products coming from somewhere, technology from somewhere, capital from somewhere, the factories are located someplace else, and the end consumer.
No, I understand that.
So therefore,
my question really was,
no, wait a bit.
My question was, what impact will it have on the commodity suppliers?
No, so therefore, what is going to happen is that the Chinese, while they might not buy the same levels, will continue to be the largest purchasers, except that they would relocate the way or the places where these commodities are.
That's from the Chinese point of view.
But the people of Zambia, for example, for the Zambians,
they will undergo restructuring, and it's a common Zambian who will suffer.
You buy and you locate the factories there, so that the Zambians are still getting, the commodities are being purchased, but the factories are there which are making the necessary productions. So I don't think that is going. The second part is that Southeast Asia and the Asian economy, intra-trade, is generally now on a rising path. So it's not so much dependence on the West. We are seeing a shift in that. And therefore it's affecting the way in which production processes are going.
Why are the Australians worried then?
No, the thing is that obviously there is going to be a short-term impact on
only short-term, you think?
I think so.
Okay.
I think for the Zambians, Venezuelans and others, this is an opportunity actually, as of now, that the commodity prices have increased and the captive market...
Have gone down.
So far, it has been good news for them, Zambians, Venezuelans and other commodity producers, because there is a competition for the commodity prices and they benefited out of it. So most of the Africans say that the Chinese demands have actually led to a lot of...
But we're talking about the slowdown.
True. That is the recent last few months phenomena. The Chinese President Xi Jinping told the POA Forum that China is going to import $10 trillion worth of raw materials. That's a huge demand for Zambians, Venezuelans and others. So the commodity prices, while there has been a decline, a gradual decline, slow decline, yet I think there is a huge demand that China is offering. Yeah. They are also offering $500 billion of investments in the next 5 years' time in these commodity exploration projects. So there is actually going to be a sustainable kind of, according to the Chinese president's view.
Professor Desai, how will China's slowdown impact India? An OECD study says that a decline in Chinese growth of 2% points from 2015 onwards would lead to 0.5% or more decline in annual GDP growth in some economies. In the case of India, they say 0.5% growth in decline in 2016. I
would be a little more cautious with that estimate because India is at the present stage with commodity prices where they are, particularly oil, it's a sweet spot. It's just right for us. That it has made life much easier for us in terms of course, if it goes down much further, there will be, it'll be impact on remittances, it'll impact on foreign investment flows, it'll impact on overseas demand for Indian goods. But this $50, $60 stuff is quite good for us, sweet. So I would not buy that 0.5%, that's such a huge impact. I don't think we are that dependent. Yes, there will be some people like iron ore exporters, etc., who will be affected. Yeah. But globally, we are not necessarily going to be that badly off because of this. Okay. I'd say that there is, in fact, I think a shift taking place in the global economy. And I suspect you'll see forecasts which are talking in terms of Indian growth being higher than Chinese growth by 2016-17. You know? These are the forecasts.
Okay. Alka, India has a trade deficit of over 4 billion with China, and it's increasing. Now, in fact, how's Chinese slowdown already impacting us? Because while imports from China are going up, engineering exports from India to China have seen a precipitous fall.
See, that's the whole, I think India-China trade particularly should also be examined in terms of the nature of the two economies that are trading with each other. And I think by itself, we've seen a huge debate in this country about this extent of the deficit that we have with the Chinese. And over again, I think the consensus has been that we needn't be overly worried because after all, you have really nothing by way of exports that you can give to China.
So medium volume exports in engineering was where we had an advantage, and that advantage people think may go.
No, but again, as I said, that if we look at the entire shift and the complexity of this whole way in which global economy itself is undergoing a change, due to a large measure, the way the Chinese are repositioning themselves, I think we should see the opportunities that are now available.
Okay, so let me take the last question on opportunities to Professor Kondapalli. Yes. So could this have some positives for India? For example, when commodity prices go down, our input prices go down. So could this help Indian firms producing entirely for the domestic market do much better? And could it also help India retrieve some export markets?
Well, in the case of the trade deficit with China, I think the key problem is Chinese economy is not a market economy status position because while we, UNCTAD suggests India is 9th in the manufacturing scale.
Leave the trade deficit aside. She's answered that. Answer my question on whether there are any positives for India in this slowdown.
Indeed. Number one is the reallocation of the manufacturing sector. If that happens in India, for instance, the labor costs are pretty high in China, estimated at around $269 as compared to about $120 for India. So if this logic functions of shifting the manufacturing base to a low labor cost areas, then obviously India is a favorable destination.
Okay, one last sentence to you. Can India benefit from this slowdown?
It could benefit, but I'd say that it will require a lot of changes in India to benefit, because the main benefit would be the shift of labor-intensive manufacturing to India. But for that, we need much more than just lower wages. Okay. Infrastructure, a regulatory environment which is much more friendly, and that's going to take time.
All right. So we've run out of time. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. Professor Alka, Acharya, Professor Srikanth, Kondapalli, Professor Nitin, Desai, thank you for coming here and discussing this complex subject for our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week, of course, as usual. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.